So we have all these monads playing out everything in pre-established harmony. But one of the things that Leibniz and other thinkers during the time period Leibniz was Leibnizing wanted to reconcile, science, religion, teleology, and mechanical explanations. So how does Leibniz make that all work? Well, again, one of his goals was reconciling the teleological, purpose-based, and mechanical. Things just happen mechanically. So here's how he does it. The teleological explanations are given in terms of purposes and final ends, goals. The mechanical explanations are presented in mechanistic terms, math, in talking about motion, etc. And these don't reference ends or purposes. So what we call the bodies, and again, in Leibniz's view, they're just collections of monads, they follow fixed laws. And he says it's harmless, perhaps even convenient, to speak of them as acting on each other in accord with mechanical principles. So, if an engineer was talking about how, parts in, say, a plane or components of a bridge were interacting, if Leibniz was alive, would he sort of look at them and say, tisk tisk, that's what you're saying is wrong, those parts do not interact? Well, no. Because it was a practical matter, they follow fixed laws, and so we would speak, kind of harmlessly and commonsensibly about objects interacting, etc. So, Leibniz wouldn't say, well, what you should say is your hand monads are in pre-established harmony with your, central monad, which harmonizes with the sandwich, which harmonizes with you. Leibniz would be fine if you say, I can reach over and pick up the sandwich, or gave an explanation in engineering. So, wouldn't be upset about that. But ultimately for him, the highest explanation for all actions must refer to the unfolding of their inner nature, of these monads, and this is all set by God. God ordains all the ends. He creates all of us, all the monads, the sandwich monads, the hand monads, all the monads make up everything, and they act in accord with, the ends that God sets for them. So according to Leibniz, putting this in English, souls act according to laws of final causes, habitations, ends, and means. Bodies act in accordance to the laws of efficient causes of motion. The two realms are in harmony with each other. So even though in a way, strictly speaking, there are not two realms, there are kind of two realms, which some critics say this is, kind of cheating. So, two realms. This allows, like we saw in our good dead friend Descartes, science gets a realm of its own, in which, talking about the bodies. However, and it's a big however, the material realm is still part of a purposive system created, directed, ordained by God. So, according to Leibniz at least, if you're going to do physics or biology or any of those sciences, you got to supplement them with theology and metaphysics, because again, it's all about the monads, which seems like perhaps a weird way to do science, but that's what he claims. And so this is how he thinks you can have science in a monad world, because he really liked the science stuff. And again, his critics probably think this is pretty odd. Now, given what I've just said, that, I talked about pre-established harmony, that you've got this, each of us is a monad, separate monads, of course, for each monads, and our movie is just playing out pre-established harmony. What room is there for freedom? Can you go off script in your movie? And the answer is no. So his view does seem to deny freedom, because everything you'll do is pre-established in your inner nature. Again, your movie is already in there. So to use kind of metaphor, it seemed like we're, like scripted robots, that everything is already in there on our, metaphorical, metaphysical hard drive, and it just plays out. It just plays. Everything you're going to feel, think, and do is already in there, and it just plays out. But, in a way, you're just a hapless observer, experiencing your life, unable to do anything. Now, oddly enough, but perhaps not, he does claim that people are free. And he kind of borrows, from Spinoza here. How so? Well, this is how he defines freedom. And when people debate about free will and freedom, quite often philosophers get into definitions of freedom. And they rightly point out when people say, freedom, I have free will, most people don't know what the hell they're talking about. They don't know what it is that they want. They'll say, I have freedom, will. And if they really get pushed, they don't know. So one thing that philosophers do, which is really annoying, is they try to actually define what it is to be free and see if it makes sense. I don't mean like political freedom here, I mean metaphysical freedom. So here's how he defines it. He says that freedom is unimpeded self-development. It's not arbitrary, unpredictable, spontaneous actions. Now, in a way that makes, some sense, because imagine if your actions were controlled by arbitrary, unpredictable, spontaneous actions. It would be, to use an analogy, but it'd be like you're having your mind would not constantly be having just random seizures. And of course, that wouldn't be free. If you have, say, random spasms of your arm, you wouldn't say, oh, look, my arm is being free. That would be not freedom. So the arbitrary, unpredictable, spontaneous actions would not seem to be free. They would be like, again, having sort of like mental seizures. Now, so what would be a lack of freedom? Well, you would lack freedom if your actions were controlled from the outside. As we saw with Spinoza took that as a definition of freedom, not being controlled from the outside. So if you were being controlled, like, for instance, to use a sci-fi example, be controlled like one of Robert Heinlein's puppet masters, or being controlled by, like in Stargate, that Goa'uld, or being controlled like by a vampire using domination or something, or like a magical spell of mind control. In that case, a person wouldn't be free, clearly. So then, why isn't God robbing us of our freedom? Well, what he claims is this. He says that God is not like a puppeteer who's pulling our strings directly. So he's not, making us do all this stuff in real time. So how does it work? Well, for Leibniz, here's how it goes. Your actions, my actions, result from our values and character. That is to say, everything you do flows from your inner nature. You do what you do because you are who you are. And the same is true of me. I do what I do because I am who I am. Which, in a way, makes sense, I suppose. So what he embraces is what's called compatibilism, which is this. All that a person does that is not the result of external coercion results from that person's own internal character. Again, you do what you do because you are what you are. So if our choices are determined by character, that is to say, you do what you do because of who you are, and you're acting consistent with your nature, he says that's all you could reasonably mean by human freedom. That's what it is to be free. You do what you do because you are what you are. You act, as a Taoist would say, in accord with your Tao. So why is it called compatibilism? Well, the idea is this. We are both determined and free. We're determined because, of course, God, creates us and makes us who we are, and we act in accord with our nature. But we're free because we're not being coerced from the outside. We're acting in accord with our character as created by God. Now, as you would imagine, critics would say, but wait, we're like, God's robots. God, creates me. He creates my character, my nature, my traits, and those just play out. So that doesn't seem like I'm free, even though my script is on my hard drive, metaphorically speaking, and I'm not being pushed around like a puppet. I wouldn't seem to be free. To use a modern analogy, think of like like an autonomous drone. where it's got all the or think of like, a self-driving car. All the programming is in there, and it drives around. And so you might say, well, yeah, I guess that's an autonomous vehicle. That's different from, say, when you're actually controlling a drone, like what we call the, like Predator drones. A lot of time they're operating, by human control, that there's a set of controls and they're controlling remotely, like you control a remote control car or remote control plane. And so in Leibniz's view, it seems we're like the autonomous drone, where it's got all the programming in there, it's created, programs in there, it's set out to do its stuff. And that would be, Leibniz's view of freedom. But of course, looking at that drone, we wouldn't say that drone's free, even though it's not being like controlled, at that moment, by someone with a, control panel, joysticks, etc. We'd still say that it's not control, it's not free of control, it's autonomous, in the sense that it doesn't have to be constantly adjusted and, using the joystick to direct around. It's all programmed in there, but it's still not free. We wouldn't say, oh, look at the freedom enjoyed by the autonomous, murder drone. But Leibniz, essentially his view is biting the bullet. Yes, that is all the freedom that there can possibly be. We are, in a sense, God's, people probably wouldn't say God's robots, but we are kind of God's robots. Now this kind of brings us to the question of, so why then does God create us? Which is an interesting question. People often don't think of like why God does this, but Leibniz has an answer. He says that each of us, each mind is like a little divinity, each thinking mind, and so it can enter into society with God. And he uses some metaphors. God is to us what our inventor is to his machine, a prince is to his subjects, a father to his children. And we form a collective, according to Leibniz. So all the thinking spirits compose what he calls the city of God, the most perfect state under the perfect monarch. So we're all part of this city of God, or literally God's creations, or his children, or his subjects, whatever metaphor you like. So then why did God create us and create the world? Well, Leibniz's answer is this. The city of God, that's to say, all of us, all thinking beings, we're the highest and most divine of God's works. And this is where God gets his glory, because he would not have his glory if this goodness and greatness were not known and admired, because you can't have glory by yourself. I mean, think of glory like in terms of fame. Can you be famous if you're the only being that exists? And the answer is no, that's not fame. And so if God has glory, interestingly enough, he needs us. We have to admire and know his greatness and goodness. So why does God need us? Well, he hasn't got glory without us. Also, in terms of him being good, in relation to this divine city, that is to say all of us, according to Leibniz, that is how God has his goodness. And there are some interesting moral questions about, could a being that is the only thing in existence, could that being be said to be good or evil? And as you might imagine, some philosophers say yes, and some say no. Now, God's wisdom and power do not depend on us. He can be wise without us, he can be powerful without us. Although the idea of being, I guess if you're the only thing in existence, you'd be the most wise and most powerful. But it would also seem to also require some comparison. So for Leibniz, we exist because God needs us for his glory and also his goodness. So that's what we do. Last bit for Leibniz, the machinery of justice. Now Leibniz claims there's a perfect harmony between the kingdom of nature, which is he calls the physical kingdom, but again for him this would be all a bunch of monads, and the moral kingdom of grace. And he believes this makes all things progress towards grace by natural means. So rather like our good dead friend Aristotle, he believes that all things head towards an end. Unlike Aristotle, he believes in God, and so he believes that all things are heading towards this grace of God. And one thing that's rather interesting about Leibniz, among many things that's interesting about him, is this notion of the machinery of justice. How so? Well, here's how it works. He says that God as architect, designer, creator of the world, satisfies in every respect God as legislator, lawmaker. And he takes this interesting view of how punishment and reward works. And it's a mechanical system. Essentially, in a way, reality is a justice engine. It punishes the wicked and rewards the good. And here's how it works. In the case of sins, he says, by the order in nature and mechanical structure of things must carry their punishment with them. So sin, on his view, does not require that God or the angels or enforcers go and toss the sinning souls into hell to be, toasted or roasted or stabbed or scorpioned or whatever they do to them, in hell by demons and devils and such. Sins just mechanically punish themselves in a way. They are instruments of their own punishment. And this is in some ways similar to Plato. Plato argues that a person who's tyrannical and evil, they'll end up punishing themselves, harming themselves. And he says in the same way, good actions obtain their rewards mechanically. So the universe is a justice machine. Sins punish themselves, good actions reward themselves. And we've often heard the claim, virtue is its own reward. Now, of course, critics will point out, because here comes the problem of evil, they'll say, hey, there are people throughout history, and probably people who are good people who do good deeds, and often they don't get rewarded. And sometimes they end up, it ends up awful. And you probably heard of historical people who've been really bad, and you probably know people who are bad, or know of them, and they seem to be doing fine, holding power, doing great, being wealthy, and not being punished. Think of cruel tyrants and warlords and people who exploit, workers and other people, bad people who are powerful and successful. And you might say, I'm not seeing this, Leibniz. This doesn't seem to be working. And of course, he has the following response, which is what we often get, which is this. He says, this cannot and ought not always happen immediately. Under this perfect government, there'll be no good action unrewarded, no bad action unpunished. So his claim is, don't worry, eventually it'll work out somehow. And a good question would be, well, how do we know that? We don't see that happening. Now, our good dead friend Kant, of course, says that this is why you got to have, God, freedom, and immortality. You got to have the immortality part for everything to work out perfectly in the end. You got to have God to ensure it does work out perfectly in the end. Now, Leibniz does claim, again without evidence, that everything must result in the well-being of the good. So why should we think this? Well, he claims that if we could just understand the order of the universe, we would find that it's great. That, again, is addressing the problem of evil. He says this is the best of all possible worlds. And so the world, he claims, surpasses all the wishes of the wisest. And again, he says this is the best of all possible worlds, the one we got. Not that it's best in every single way, but of all the worlds that are possible, this is the best. And so it is impossible to render it better than it is for all in general and ourselves in particular. This is as good as it gets. So God ought to be our whole aim of our will and can alone make our happiness. But again, we don't really get a meaningful choice in this, because I guess if we're happy, it's because God already put that in our program, and if we're not, it's already in there as well. But it is an interesting idea that the universe is a justice machine, and I guess like anybody who wants justice and goodness, that would be, if it were true, would certainly be comforting, that maybe not right now, but eventually people who are cruel and vicious and selfish and brutal, eventually their sins would punish them. Or even better, they would become better people. And that the people who are good would be appropriately, treated. That there would be justice. And the obvious question is, one would ask Leibniz, where is the proof of this engine of justice? Or is it just a hope? Or even worse, a trick to make us to believe that things will work out, so perhaps don't work so hard at it now because it'll all be taken care of. So that takes us to the end of our good dead friend Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz looking at his monads. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.